Hi everyone, welcome to this Unit 3, the morning unit for Tuesday the 7th. So on this unit we're going to look at the broad methodological choices open to research. We started this discussion already, but here we're going to really go into more details between qualitative and quantitative. So not for the purpose of your proposal, but because as I've said, I'm going to limit you to qualitative because I want it to be pragmatic and realist. But for the purpose of the course, we have to look more broadly at the choices that researchers generally can have between these two choices. So the objectives for today are, first of all, we're going to examine some of the media sources, and at the same time we are going through that exercise, which is, as you see in every unit, we're going to also get you to think about the subtext of that exercise, which is what is interesting research, what kind of research are people yearning for? How can you design a question that has a target and that's going to interest the public? All right, so we're going to tackle that sort of subtext question as well. Then we're going to examine the various methodological choices that are open to the researcher. We're going to look at the rationale of these broad methodological choices. We're also going to look at the assessment. So how do we assess those methodologies, which is going to be important for you because you'll be going back to that in your assignment 8, I believe, where you will be doing the critique of a journal article. So the journal article that you'll be selecting will have chosen a methodology, and you'll have to assess how effective that methodology has been. And you will see that we have different criteria for qualitative and quantitative. So it's really important you take note of that, and you're going to use it when you get to your critical review. We're also going to practice this with some vignettes. I found the exercise interesting because it's going to start putting you in a state of mind where you're going to be trying to see how you would phrase the question, who the stakeholders would be, what kind of methodology you would envisage. It's going to start putting you in that sort of frame of mind, researcher frame of mind. And it's there's no, it's not assessed, so you win at trying, and there's no penalty there if you get it wrong. It'll be practice for further down the line. We also are going to highlight some of the hurdles that are possible as people make these methodological choices, and then we're going to think it also, as always, I'm encouraging to look at to think of the work of a researcher within an ecological context. So always looking at the systems and the variables that surround that researcher. Again, we don't do this in a void, we don't do this in a vacuum, we do it in an environment, and that environment contains many variables that are going to have an impact on our choices. And so we have to remind ourselves of this. I'm hoping that now my Screencastify has decided to capture the actual slide. I'm sorry about that. I think I clicked something at some point and I'm desperately trying to get back to the original setting, but I think it should be okay this time. Okay, so before we examine the media sources, again, I'd like you to tackle the sort of subtext question, which is, why am I making you sort of tackle those media questions? Is to develop this sense of what is interesting research, what is sort of exciting research, what is the research that people are reading, what is the field yearning for in terms of topics. So before we even tackle that today, I'm going to actually ask you to brainstorm, and this is going to feed into the Wednesday afternoon research question presentation, because at this point now you're probably starting to have some very pragmatic ideas of what you might want to focus on for your own research question. So I'm opening the form number 1 to the whole class, and you will be discussing the sort of ideas that you think in 2020 qualifies high visibility research, particularly for us in terms of inclusion. But don't think of inclusion just in terms of visibility. Think in terms of inclusion widely, because you're an inclusive cohort, and we're not just going to discuss visibility. Inclusion has many dimensions. So try and include that in the sorts of questions that you think might be topical. The questions that have a public at the moment, a public that's yearning for publications. Once you finish that, so take your time. Once you finish that, we're going on to the media sources. So it's very sort of flipped in Unit 3. You're doing all the work. I'm just doing a voiceover to guide you. So spend at least, I think, half an hour, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour thinking about that, because that's going to help you for your assignment on Wednesday afternoon. When you're done, I would suggest you spend 30, 45 minutes to select one of the media sources, and then again, try and say, starting again from what do you think is a good media topic in the current educational research landscape. Is what you're seeing in the media sources I'm providing, are you seeing something that fits the bill? If yes, why? If no, why? What are the stakeholders in the research? Who is that research made for? Who's the targeted audience? Because that's going to be really relevant in how you assess it. What's the methodology from the information you're given? You're not always given the full information, but what can you grasp about the methodology? Does that methodology seem appropriate? Does the research design seem appropriate? Or is there something a bit, wonky that you would need to rectify? And again, be bold. There's nothing wrong saying this isn't right, or methodology is not appropriate, or there's a different way of framing this that would be more useful. So I would assume you'll spend about 30-45 minutes on this. Deductive and inductive, I'm not going to spend too much time because we discussed this already. Remember, I'm just going to remind you, because it's a heavy concept, that generally most research is deductive because it starts with theory. Theory leads to a choice of methodology. Methodology leads to a choice of tools, and then you apply that. So the process is downwards from the theory. Inductive is a process that starts from data with no theory, and sort of mad scrambling around to find a way of categorizing that data with no theory, so no lens. So you will see it's a process that's very tortuous, very arduous, but eventually, with rigor, you're able to let the data speak, so to speak, and actually have theory emerge from that data. This is only done when there is no theory available, which is very rare, because there are literally thousands of theories actually already out there that usually are perfectly fine lens for the phenomena that you're looking at. And before you go on creating theory, normally what happens is you can shift theory, borrow them from another field, you can merge them, you can combine them. So lots of things you can do before you get to the point where you actually assert that there is no theory. But it's good that you remember that you have this in mind, because you will sometimes hear people talking about the inductive process and grounded theory. And it's one of the methodologies that you're allowed to choose for your group presentation on Thursday. So maybe someone will be choosing that. So the next task would be qualitative or quantitative. We'll divide you in two groups. So the groups are already set up. They're the same groups as when we're doing the Wednesday presentation. And I've created two discussion chats so that you can go and answer these questions as groups. So one group will look at quantitative methodology and look at the pros and cons, repercussions, and all of these things. And the other group will look at qualitative methodologies, the pros and cons, repercussions, what's the field most receptive to. And I will jump in at the end once you've had this debate. Obviously, if you have time, go and see what the other camp has argued and what they are coming up with. But it'll be sort of fun to have the class split in two, and both sides arguing for one theory or looking at one theory while the other one focuses on the other. So this should take you probably another 30 minutes to 40 minutes tomorrow morning. In terms of qualitative concerns, what's important is that when we come to assessing quantitative methodologies, the criteria are completely different. So some notions are going to be important within quantitative. The notion of sampling, is the sample size large enough? Validity needs to be a hugely important criteria. Variation, standard deviation, margin of error, unanticipated variables. Those all terms that are going to have to be understood within quantitative methodologies. I've got a little guide there, which I bought from a university library online. It's an open resource, and it's very useful in a sense. It's not going to overwhelm you. It's going to familiarize you with all the vocabulary that's appropriate for quantitative assessment of quantitative methodologies. You won't have to do that at this stage. You may end up having to use it if you're looking at critically assessing a journal article in one of your final assignments that is a quantitative study. So then you would have to go back to these tools and use these tools to do your assessment of the methodology. What are meta-analysis? So I put that there because it's a good point to familiarize you with that term. So sometimes you're going to hit papers or journal articles that look like a long lit review, but they don't call themselves long lit review. They call themselves meta-analysis, or sometimes they call themselves systematic reviews. So what are these, and in which camp do they situate themselves? Is it qualitative or is it quantitative? It's going to sort of shock you a little bit because it doesn't contain data. It seems like it doesn't contain data. It seems like it's a long lit review, but in fact it is a study, and it has a methodology, and it is quantitative. So what meta-analysis and systematic review do is they treat the findings of other studies as data, as raw data, and then they apply methodology to it to get to, normally they have a hypothesis and get to prove or disprove a hypothesis. So they don't go in the field and collect data. They limit themselves to doing library searches and using the findings of other studies to see whether there are patterns or trends in these findings. So the way a meta-analysis or systematic review would go is the researchers would set up a methodology by which they would say that they are looking at every article that deals with this topic, for example. Let me be practical so you have an idea. And it's looking at the use of outdoors education with kids with challenging behavior. So you would say that's my topic, and I'm looking at every single study that looks at this. Normally, you limit a meta-analysis or a systematic review to a geographical area. So you'll say, I'm doing this for North America, I'm doing this for Europe, I'm doing this for the global North, but you're going to set limits to your search, and then you're going to use search engines in libraries to pick up. You'll set up keywords depending on here would be outdoors, challenging behaviors. You may maybe put inclusion too, and then you will use the library search engines to find every article that fits the criteria. So it may generate a huge amount of some systematic reviews or meta-analysis can, have 1,000, 1,500 articles that fit the bill. So then they will sometimes look at find a way of scrutinizing this, going through it, and eliminating maybe some false findings. Because it's a search engine, sometimes someone manually goes in and checks that actually everything that's been selected by the search engine definitely fits the bill, that there's no false positive, so to speak. And then they will go about using that as data within certain years, so 2000 to 2016, to see the trends that have been established in articles that dealt with outdoors education and challenging behaviors and inclusion. And the way they would do that is normally they would use software analysis that would be run on the text of the articles, and that will pick up. So the software is set up to pick up certain elements as it goes through the text of these studies. And then normally they come up with trends that will say, for example, out of 1,600 studies between that year and that year, 800 show positive outcome, 700 show negative outcome. We see a trend where outdoors education is combined with sort of outdoors counseling. I'm making it up, but you see what I mean. They are going to be established some big trends that they're able to see through the data. It is data because they're using the findings of the other studies as their raw data and applying methodology to it. It is always quantitative because, as you see, it's always large numbers, and it's really sort of fairly unidimensional research. We're trying to prove something or disprove something. So they are interesting studies. I wouldn't recommend taking one of those for your critical evaluation because they're totally different. They're not totally different. You follow the same critical review process, but because you don't have that sort of data collection in the field, they're a little more tricky to review through the normal pattern. So I would just, it's good that you're aware of them, you know what they are. If you encounter them, you know why they have that name or what it means, but I wouldn't recommend in the exercise in this course to tackle them for the critical review. Qualitative concerns. So the big mistakes which I see all the time in first year students in the graduate program is that you may, in your critical review, take a journal article that is qualitative, and when it comes time to assess the methodology, you're going to say things like, I'm not sure about the validity. Well, as you see in the terms that I've quoted at the top in terms of criteria for assessment, qualitative methodologies are not concerned with validity. They're not purporting to say this is transferable elsewhere. They're not purporting to have a sample size that is sufficient to say that this is somehow, a phenomenon that is valid everywhere. They don't do that. They don't do large scale sampling. They don't function in this way. So it's really, really wrong when you assess qualitative methodology to bring it back or bring your assessment back to the notions of sampling or validity, because it doesn't start from there. In fact, what it sort of demonstrates is your misunderstanding of the methodology itself. It's not a valid critique. So instead, you might say, what do we use as benchmark? What do we use as criteria then to know what is good qualitative review research and what is bad qualitative research? So I've given you some examples there. If you go to these big manuals I've spoken to you about, and Cresswell's, for example, and things like this, they will have a specific list of criteria that they've narrowed down for every single specific qualitative methodology, using the literature again, going back and seeing what authors have successfully used as criteria for the assessment of that specific qualitative methodology. But some of the general terms that you will see is richness of data, relevance to the field, pertinence, suitability of participants, congeniality of the data collection methods. Are they well suited to the population that you are trying to to deal with? For example, they're going to argue that if you're working with kids, your ethnographic tools. If you're working with kids at risk, kids that are at the risk of exclusion from school, your ethnographic means, if you're doing qualitative ethnographic research, should be something that is, fun, something they find relevant, something that it's not going to bother them or seem too formal or seem like, from another world. You're going to have to work with tools that have meaning for them. So that could be a criteria to assess your qualitative methodology. Respect, ease and comfort with the participants. So all these are criteria that are going to be relevant when you look at what qualitative methodology is trying to do. It's much more hands-on, and it's not about, again, this notion of truth or establishing this universal truth or these principles that is transferable and validated, where qualitative methodology is not interested in that. So be careful never to bring these criteria back into qualitative, because it really just demonstrates that you're confused. So you've got a few resources here. They're listed in the readings in APA format, but here I've just given them to you as hyperlink. And the Kilman and Cataldo and Seeley is downloaded as a PDF on your unit. You probably won't have time to look at them. Well, you have time to look at them today, but you won't have time to read. But have a browse. They're not top sort of recent, sort of sources. I know I tell you nothing older than 10 years, preferably 5 years. I cheat sometimes. I cheated here because, to be honest, methodologies don't change. They don't, methodology guides don't change. They've been the same for 10 years. So I think here the relevance of having something, top, 2018 is not going to be that massive. And to be honest, if we aim for 2018, you're going to have a lot of books, chapters that are not accessible, whereas these are open PDFs, which I found online. For your purpose, not having to buy anything and being able to browse freely, these three guides are going to be very, very useful. They don't come from the film education, but I think everything that you read in there is totally transferable. So you've got one on health and one on social services, and they're really good little summaries of some of the concerns of how we assess. First, how we carry out qualitative research, but also how we assess qualitative research and what some of the criteria might be. So I think browse on this if you have a little time this morning, and then put them aside, and you're going to want to come back to these when you're writing your own methodology section, or when you're assessing someone's study in the assessment where you're on the assignment where you're doing a critical review. They are going to be very useful to you as practical guides. These are some of the quality methodologies I wanted to introduce. They're not, I'm not going to spend too long on them because we are going to open and unpack all this on Thursday when you do your presentations. There are more qualitative methodologies, that subgroups that you can add to this. There's no exhaustive or final list of qualitative methodologies, but some of the other ones that I could have added would be less frequent, only discussed by certain authors. You'd have more problems finding information about them and being able to explain them. So these are the major ones. These are the ones that you encounter all the time, and you should have no problem finding information to share with your colleagues during your presentation. Here's all qualitative research phenomenological. So phenomenology is a tricky one, because phenomenology is a theory and phenomenology is also a methodology. And then it's also an adjective that can be used to processes. So out of all the vocabulary that we're going to encounter, phenomenology is going to be really, really tricky. Phenomenology is a theory that sets itself against positivism. Positivism is the theory in pure and natural sciences that you see all around you. That argues really that there's one universal truth, that we're walking, progressively towards that truth through a system of hypotheses that are proven or disproven, and that's what you encounter all around. That's what in labs, in science, in pure science. That's what we discuss. Phenomenology is a theory that is more concerned with social sciences, and it emerged after the First World War. Developed a lot during the 1930s through a body called the School of Frankfurt. And phenomenology has argued that this notion of one universal truth is not always a relevant lens. And they argue that yes, of course, when you build a bridge, you're going to be talking to your engineer about one universal truth, and they, principles of engineering that are proven or disproven, and so forth. But social scientists have argued that really there's limitations to this, that when you're looking at a phenomenon in social science, there isn't one universal truth. There are, in fact, many truths. And these truths are subjective realities that are constructed by the individual. So I'll give you an example. If we're looking at tablets in a school, you're going to be having a very difficult task if you're trying to talk about the truth that you're trying to reach with regards to that phenomena, because in fact there isn't one truth about tablets in school. There's a reality that's been constructed by students with regards to tablets in schools. Parents have another reality which they've constructed on based on their lived experience about tablets in schools. Teachers have another reality, that subjective reality they've constructed through their lived experience with tablets in schools, and so forth. So you have the same phenomena, that tablet in school, but you have all these stakeholders that have actually constructed a reality that is very meaningful to them. And therefore, for us as researchers, we want to enter that reality. But that reality is not universal. That reality is very subjective, and it's built on a lived experience around that phenomenon. So you see in that little example that phenomenology is terribly important in theory, because in social sciences, it suddenly opens us up to saying, okay, we have sort of freed from this notion there's only one reality that we're getting close to, and saying actually in social sciences there's many realities that we need to get close to. We sort of drop this notion of objectivity, because when it comes to something that is lived on an everyday basis, the way people construct their reality vis-a-vis that phenomena is just as important for us than any notion of having everyone agree around the purpose or the use of an issue within a school environment. So phenomenology is a theory. I've just described phenomenology as a theory. But phenomenology is also a methodology, and that some of you may select that for Thursday. When it's a methodology, it's not as ethereal and ambitious and sort of up there. It's just more about saying if you want to do some qualitative methodology, you usually have to look around people's perceptions, so people's lived experience. So you could have another theoretical approach, but you might still be using phenomenology as a method, and then it's something a little more mundane, something a little more practical, which just leads you to say, okay, I'm going to have to actually penetrate people's visions of something. I'm going to get into their head and see how they construct their approach to a phenomena. And in that sense, it becomes a methodology. Now, you are going to sometimes see people describe qualitative research generally as phenomenological, and that's become an adjective in the sense that, yeah, if you're in a qualitative environment, you're pretty much looking at people's perceptions of things. That's what you're interested in. And so, in that third sense, phenomenology applies, yes, indeed, to all qualitative research, in a sense that, in the end, qualitative research is always about people's perceptions, people's feelings towards something, and that gives it a phenomenological flavor, right? So I hope I deconstructed that and avoided sort of confusion. But whenever you're faced with that, honestly, whenever in research you're faced with the word phenomenology, you're going to have to actually stop and say, hang on, are you talking to me about theory? Are you talking about methodology? Or are you using this simply as an adjective to describe a flavor of research, right? That's going to be very important. And then before I talk to you about inductive and deductive process, and here again I was talking about theory, but I need to stop and just tell you that the way I've used the terms is with regards to theory. So when we have a reflection on theory, we talk about inductive processes and deductive processes. So deductive, theory down, inductive, starting from data, creating theory. But inductive is also used in when we talk about methodologies, and when we talk about inductive methodologies, we talk about methodologies that are not starting with a hypothesis, but starting with lots of raw data and getting to sort of an interpretation of that raw data, a sort of categorization of the raw data. So in that sense, yes, all qualitative research is inductive, because you will see that it doesn't start with a hypothesis. It starts with a theory, but it doesn't start with a hypothesis. That's only quantitative research that starts with that. So again, there, don't be confused. Inductive has two meanings. When we talk about theory, it's process I've explained to you before. Deductive in most 98% of research, inductive only when we do grounded theory. But when we talk about methodologies only, not theory, we're going to call qualitative methodologies inductive, in the sense that they don't start with a hypothesis. They start with the data itself, right? And they lead to try and get to some findings from the categorization of that data, but never involve a hypothesis. So I apologize for that. The world of research uses a lot of terms, sometimes repeatedly in different sense. So don't be thrown by it. It's just important to always clarify: am I talking about theory? Am I talking about methodology? Am I talking in general public layperson's terms? So always sort of make sure that you understand the meaning that's being attributed to the word that you're using. Mixed method. I'm not going to spend too long on this because I've explained it to you in the Collaborate session. Mixed methods, again, is something that's always tempting to graduate students, but be very careful with it. It's a bit of a wishy-washy thing, and there's nothing worse than bad mixed methods. So again, I'll explain that when mixed method is well done, it is a beautiful process, but it's normally a very vast process, and it normally involves someone working with very qualitative methods that helps them bring to the surface maybe trends and phenomena that have never been explored. So there's that innovative, creative, here's a new thing aspect that happens through the quality process. They may have a collaborator. That collaborator works in a quantitative setting with the funding that goes with it, and the tools and the skill, the RA and the teams that go with it. And suddenly that collaborator is interested in, hang on, you've looked at this. I'm now interested in seeing if this is something that we see provincially, or we see in every school, or we see in the whole of Canada, or even we see this internationally. That's the beautiful mixed method process. So it's not actually a compromise, it's actually the coming together of both processes. That qualitative work happens, that quantitative work happens, and they come together around the same topic and see whether everything that's found here can then be looked at in terms of transferability, and is it seen elsewhere as well. So that's the ideal mixed methods process. What is not a mixed method process that's successful is when you have a researcher that is working basically inherently from qualitative basis, and then has sort of remorse, and at the end of their process says, hang on, I'm going to put a survey here. So typical example is you have someone who, I review articles like this all the time. It bugs me, and I have 12 teachers. I'm doing a qualitative work around their perceptions around parents who like to take holidays outside of term times, right? Here's a nice little research. So teachers' perceptions of parents who disregard term schedules and take holidays out of term. A nice little project. It's very qualitative. You'd expect really sort of in-depth, semi-directive interviews where you let the participant talk, and then you find some sort of categorization to make some sense of the data, to find maybe some key themes that you can organize the data on, and then your findings would emerge from that categorization of the data. And this is all beautiful and it would work. And then on page 2 of the methodology, suddenly you see they're saying, oh, and by the way, I gave them a survey asking them about their age and their experience in teaching and where they took their BEd. And you think, why? Why is that person suddenly on this? There's no validity. It's not an appropriate sample. It brings nothing to the study. You're not going to be able to get any sort of information from that. It's not quantitative. So why go and throw a veneer of quantitative approach on something that's qualitative? And so you've just made a big mess because you were actually working through a very rigorous process of qualitative analysis, and now you've gone and thrown something that makes no sense. So beware when you see that. That is just bad mixed methods. It's not something that's, and unfortunately, at graduate level, often supervisors encouraging students to do that. If you're encouraged to do that and your thesis students, just stand your ground and say no, because it makes no sense and it doesn't show your strength. It shows a sort of confusion again as to what the methods are. Now, why does it happen? It happens in practice an awful lot because the reality, and this again takes us to the ecological sort of dimensions. The reality is that when you apply for funding. There is very little funding available for qualitative research, and particularly if you're going at provincial and national level, there's a great inequality, and it's getting better. It was really, really terrible 10 to 20 years ago. It's getting better. There's now, funds available, but I can guarantee you that if there are two applications going forward at SSHRC level, so at federal level, the quantitative study is going to get the money, before the qualitative study gets it. Why? I mean, you can see why. If you've got people's tax money and you're giving it away, you're going to want something that you can turn back and say, oh, we invested in this, but look, we can show that this is a trend across Canada, or this is a trend across a province. There's always going to be that push that when it comes to money, we're going to prefer quantitative data. We're going to prefer something that actually is, we can relate back to all the stakeholders within that province, all the stakeholders within that country, and say, there, that's what you got for your money. You got something that we can actually say has validity for all of you, something that can be useful for all of you. So it's still kind of normal that those big grants go to quantitative research. And so the reason why you see a lot of mixed methods, because a lot of people start off with qualitative methodology, and then they have buyer's remorse. They think, oh my God, I'm not getting my grant, so I'm going to stick a little bit of mixed methods in there. And that makes no sense as well. And it's quite see-through, and you don't get the grants more because you do that. It's just you make a fool of yourself. So keep that in mind and avoid that in your future practice. External variables. So what are external variables, again, that will come into your chosen methodology? Well, don't forget, often, again, it's ethics. I'd like to use this, but that's never going to work. So for you in schools, unfortunately, a lot of methods like ethnography is really great. Hopefully someone will take that for Thursday's presentation. But ethnography, again, means that you will insert yourself in the community and become an insider to that community. So with kids, not only that means that you want to video, you want to use photo, you'll see that there's a lot of visual ethnography that's done. It doesn't have to be words. We can use images and sort of journaling, video journaling and photo journaling and things like this, so that we have a good insider view. But you can't do any of that in schools. So there, the external variable is your ethics. You're not going to be able to ever use those methodologies with little kids. You can use with them with teachers, use them with parents, but we'll see towards the end of the course what ethical rules are there, and really there's going to be some very, very strong protections against that. Other things, again, is money. Some methodologies are very time consuming, and they are going to take hours of transcription, and you're not going to be able to do that as a researcher. You're going to have to hire someone. I've got an hour at the moment. You'd be surprised how quickly the checks go out. It's a lot of money, even if it's little projects. So that often is where the decisions happen, right? You might choose one methodology against another because you don't have money to expand in terms of the analysis. It's going to just take too long, the process of transcription and analysis. Sometimes as well, I mean, we work within, we are employees as well. We're not just independent researchers. And sometimes you are in departments where the flavor directs the work that's being done. So you can be in departments where the flavor is quantitative or the flavor is qualitative, and you're going to have a tough time as an employee doing the opposite, because you're going to be seen as subversive because that department just doesn't do qualitative or doesn't do quantitative. So the reality of that sort of employment context needs to be acknowledged as well. It's almost politics, like office politics, that lead you into certain choices. And, intention of wanting to be in certain journals, certain reviews, certain journals versus others. When you are even thinking of publishing and you start writing, you know very well that certain journals will not publish qualitative or will not publish quantitative. I mean, they may say they will, but they don't. You can read through them and you quickly realize that they have a distinct flavor, and that's not what they publish. So, the choice of where to be published sometimes pushes you to choose a methodology as well. And there's other variables. Here I'm just keep an open mind about the variables. There's hundreds of variables around you as an employee and as a person within institutions and within organizations that will lead you to go one way or the other, and we should keep them in mind and not ignore them. So this takes us on to the vignettes, which will conclude the morning. So I've given you 4 vignettes. I found those useful in the past, and students have found them useful. You're going to start some conversations. Just pick one, and hopefully you'll spread around, and we'll have them, most of them covered. Pick one that you like, and it's it's a general sort of, what would you think about this general topic, and then it asks you to basically start narrowing down and think, okay, yes, I'm interested, but why am I interested, and what kind of question would I design, what kind of methodology would I choose, who would be the stakeholders. Always come back to that. in terms of both the stakeholders, the target audience, but also as you do the methodology, who am I actually studying, right? Sometimes students at this level, when you begin your reflection, are not always explicit. Am I looking at this in terms of students? Am I looking at teachers? Am I looking at parents? Who is the group that I'm actually studying and researching? So make that very obvious as well. And then try and discuss methodology, and then we'll take it from there and see what your conclusions are. And you have the resources. So that closes the morning, and then I'm going to meet you at 12 to 12:30, and we'll wrap up on this. I'll have a look at the vignettes before I come online for the collaborate session, so I can give you a little bit of feedback, and then we will go on into the afternoon session. So it goes very quickly this week. You're already in day 2. It's incredible how quickly it goes, but I hope you're going well. It's a little surreal for me as well. I've never done this one week online. But as far as I'm concerned, it's working. Got a routine there. Things seem to be working. So I hope it's the same at your end. If there's anything at all, let me know when we come on Collaborate for the synchronous sessions, and we will tweak any issues that you are seeing. But so far, so good. We're going through at the right pace, and what you're doing is exactly the same thing as we would have done face-to-face. We're able to transfer a lot of these discussions online. So hopefully we're doing okay, and we'll have a good time this week. See you at 12, and have a good morning.